Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight. Ukraine doesn't need more ideas on what a peace process could look like, said the NATO chief at the alliance's meeting in Brussels. The Ukrainian foreign minister was also in attendance, presenting his country's tough position on membership in the alliance. More on that in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at the latest headlines. Visa scandal in Poland and the final report of a special committee. Criminal charges laid against 11 people, including the former prime minister from the Law and Justice Party. South Korean crisis. President declares martial law. Parliament votes to block it. Georgian prime minister says an attempt to organize a revolution has failed. Protesters take to the streets for another day. The Russians are advancing almost daily, and the situation on the Eastern Front is becoming increasingly difficult. Ukraine is the main topic of the meeting of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels. The stronger the support for Ukraine, the stronger its position at the negotiating table will be, says Mark Rutte, the alliance's Secretary General. Our correspondent Marek Steele is in Brussels. Good evening, Marek. So what was said today at the NATO headquarters? What can you tell us?
Good evening. Well, there has been no breakthrough when it comes to Ukraine's path towards a NATO membership. Receiving an invitation into NATO was one of the expectations that Andriy Sybiha, the Ukrainian foreign minister who attended the first day of the summit here in Brussels, had before he had come to this summit. The NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said that he rejected this invitation to NATO, at least issuing it now. He spoke, however, about an irreversible path that Kyiv was on towards NATO membership. He also called on allies here in Brussels to provide more weapons to Kyiv.
Ukraine is entering another crucial winter, and Russia's aggression shows no sign of abating. Just the opposite. Putin is ramping up his rhetoric and reckless actions. He is using Ukraine as a testing ground for experimental missiles and is deploying North Korean soldiers in this illegal war. But we will all need to do more, especially now. The stronger our military support to Ukraine is now, the stronger their hand will be at the negotiating table. And the sooner we can end Russian aggression once and for all in Ukraine.
As I mentioned, Ukraine attended this meeting hoping for an invitation into NATO. This didn't happen, but this morning Kyiv has rejected any other security guarantees, receiving them other than NATO membership. In a statement published this morning by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kyiv, the Ukrainian state says, with the bitter experience of the Budapest Memorandum behind us, we will not accept any alternatives, surrogates or substitutes for Ukraine's full membership in NATO. Of course, here the Foreign Ministry is referring to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when Ukraine passed on its nuclear arsenal to Russia in exchange for security guarantees, which were breached only 20 years later in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the attack against Donbas. Andriy Sybiha, who, as I mentioned, attended this meeting here in Brussels, spoke more about the security guarantees that Ukraine wants.
Any long-term decisions on long-term security on the cost of Ukrainian security are inappropriate and unacceptable. This document or this paper failed to secure Ukrainian security and transatlantic security. So we must avoid to repeat such mistakes.
Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski, who also took part in this summit here in Brussels, backed his Ukrainian counterpart in this very regard. He said that Ukraine had the right to feel disappointment as these security guarantees were not respected today. Andriy Sybiha also asked his allies here in Brussels for more support. He said his country needs at least 19 air defense systems to be able to defend its energy infrastructure from attacks from Russia. There will be a second day of the summit taking place days. Tomorrow on the agenda then is Allied defense, especially on the eastern flank, and ways of countering Russian threats. In recent weeks and months, European leaders and ministers have been, preparing for a possible change, the upcoming January change of administration in Washington. So Europe has been ramping up its defenses, and this will be the main topic of discussions here today in Brussels, tomorrow in Brussels. Back to you.
That was Marek Steele reporting from Brussels. With just a few weeks remaining until Poland takes on the presidency of the European Council in Brussels, Prime Minister Donald Tusk has highlighted his country's main goals. Warsaw's agenda encompasses several key issues, many of them focused on keeping the European bloc safe from the Russian aggression. Katarzyna Nowicka has more.
Security, defense, and a unified policy toward Russia are just a few of Poland's priorities in the coming EU presidency. We want Europe to take on the Polish perspective, says Prime Minister Donald Tusk at a meeting with the EU Council Secretary General Therese Blanchett.
13 years have passed since Poland first assumed the rotating presidency. At that time, I was also Prime Minister. It is a serious challenge, but almost everything around us has changed since then. We are awaiting potentially groundbreaking developments regarding war and peace just east of our border. Some European priorities will be adjusted. The issue of security and a realistic assessment of relations with Russia are fundamental for the EU's future.
The member states, the other institutions, they are counting very much on this Polish presidency of the Council that is coming under your authority.
Poland will assume the rotating EU presidency on January 1st, 2025, and will remain in this role for the next 6 months.
Poland's Parliamentary Investigative Committee into the so-called cash for visa scandal has adopted a final report after nearly a year of hearings. 11 separate notices will be sent out to the prosecutor's office concerning high-profile members of the former Law and Justice government. Our reporter Karolina Stolzman has more.
A parliamentary committee in Poland is pushing for indictment of various officials of the previous government for their alleged role in the illicit sale of visas.
This visa fraud scandal is basically like other countries when you can buy your visa to come to the Schengen zone.
11 notices will now be sent to the prosecutor's office. 3 of them concern former Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, former Foreign Minister Zbigniew Rau, and former Interior Minister Mariusz Kamiński.
The charges are abuse of rights and neglect of duty to the detriment of the public interest and for financial gain, as well as passive influence peddling.
According to the report, the Law and Justice government let 3,610,000 people into Poland during its tenure, with individual officials profiting of issued visas. For example, through the Poland Business Harbor, a program aimed to simplify the visa procedure for IT specialists, startups, and companies without requiring work permits.
I have suspended the Poland Business Harbor, through which hundreds, if not thousands of Russian citizens entered Poland.
The prosecutor's office will now look into the suspects reported by the parliamentary committee.
Georgians are out in large numbers for the 6th night of protests in Tbilisi and throughout the country. As other days, protesters are gathering in a peaceful march near the parliament. Police brutality, however, is not diminishing. Last night, 22 people were detained and 1 person is in a critical condition. Now, let's go to our correspondent, Don Arleth, who is in Tbilisi this very moment. Good evening, Don. What did you witness last night? What did you witness last night in the early morning hours?
Day 6 and the protests here in the capital of Georgia continue. Now tonight, significantly more people here on the streets. Maybe not quite as violent in terms of fireworks, but we've been told that people have come from cities from around the country and are out here showing their support for this movement after last night's brutal crackdown. Now, last night, the police shut this area down much earlier than in the previous protests. They also used violence against protesters, rubber bullets, and tear gas. We were tear gassed a few times last night, just like everybody else here on the streets. As the night went on, we actually witnessed quite a horrific incident with a young man who appears to have taken a brutal shot to the head and perhaps even a shot to the body. It's been reported in local news today that a 22-year-old man was hit in the head with a tear gas canister, rendering him brain dead, and he is now in the ICU in critical condition. Now, whether this is the same individual that we saw last night, we're unable to confirm as of today, but if we're still waiting to see what the situation is with this young man, as he could become the first victim of these protests. Now, a lot of people have been comparing this to what happened in Ukraine, the Maidan, of course. Still, we haven't seen quite the brutality that we saw in Ukraine, but with the numbers out tonight, this indicates that Georgians are not giving up at this point. They're going to continue these protests. And of course, the Prime Minister claiming earlier today that the attempt at the Maidan movement was thwarted by police here in the capital. We're just going to have to wait and see how this night goes on to see if it is more brutal than the night before. Reporting from Tbilisi, Don Arleth, TVP World.
As the protests in Tbilisi continue to escalate, the Prime Minister of Georgia has accused the opposition party of orchestrating a revolution. In its short history of independence, Georgia has seen contested elections, revolutions, and even wars. The presence of Russia has been omnipresent in the country of some 4 million residents. Ovidiusz Nicieja has this report.
Barricades on the streets, gas masks, and lasers. That's how protesters in Tbilisi showed their disapproval to what they see as their country drifting away from the EU and closer to Russia.
They have a history of knowing what happens when you let Russia have its word in Georgia, so they're not ready to accept that.
Until 1991, Georgia, a country in the Caucasus, was a Soviet republic. Since then, the divorce from Russia has been a tough one. Independent Georgia has faced regional conflicts, which in 2008 escalated into a war against Russia. The Russian invasion led to hundreds of deaths and the displacement of hundreds of thousands.
Georgia has experienced firsthand what actually Ukraine has been experiencing over the past 3 years because of the war of 2008.
Even now, Russian soldiers occupy some 20% of Georgia's territory. So far, though, experts say that a new Russian invasion is rather unlikely.
Russia simply does not have enough resources to intervene in Georgia.
But there were revolutions before in Georgia. In 2003, the so-called Rose Revolution ousted President Eduard Shevardnadze, who was the Soviet Union's last foreign minister. The revolution took place following a disputed parliamentary election.
Even if you take the Rose Revolution, there was always a leader, there was always a face that you could pinpoint to say that, okay, this is the person.
This leader was Mikhail Saakashvili, later Prime Minister and President of Georgia. It was Saakashvili who led Georgia during the Russian invasion in 2008. Now the former president is in prison. The current protests have no clear leader. Many participants say that it's a grassroots movement. The Georgian government, however, disagrees.
These attempts are funded from abroad, and this funding is not transparent. This is why certain actors were against the law on transparency. They wanted a revolution to be organized in a non-transparent way. I remind everyone that there will be no revolution in Georgia.
The opposition claims that special forces are involved in suppressing the protest.
And then when they arrest these people, they are beaten. All 80% of them are beaten and have injuries to the face and to the head, which shows that it's very systematic and very well directed.
More uncertainty is to come in Georgia. This month, the contested parliament will elect a new president of the republic. The current president, however, says that she will not accept that vote, as she believes the parliament is illegal.
South Korea is one of the largest economies in the world, and Poland is one of its largest arms importers. Meanwhile, South Korea is sinking into a political crisis. The president, Yoon Suk-yeol, declared martial law and sent the army into parliament. However, the parliament voted to lift martial law, and the soldiers eventually left the premises. What actually happened in South Korea and what's next? For more commentary, we now move to Singapore to talk with Tomasz Sajewicz, Polish radio's correspondent to China and South Korea. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. How do you think the situation will develop further, and does it have a potential of escalating beyond what it is now? What are we to expect in days to come?
Absolutely. In my opinion, we have to wait and see what will happen. At the moment, we still see that people are gathering in front of the parliament in Seoul, in South Korea. What happened? Yoon Suk-yeol, unfortunately, and for him, his rates of support is lower than 20%. And last night, he decided that quoting the threat, imminent threat from North Korea, and quoting that opposition parties are blocking work of the government, he declared a martial law. What we saw next is that exactly the military tried to enter the building of the parliament. It was unsuccessful. Then the 190 members of the parliament out of 300 voted against martial law. At the moment, what we are observing now, it's exactly 4 a.m. In South Korea, in Seoul, 3 a.m. in Singapore. The turmoil is still extended, and absolutely, I would say all my friends, all South Koreans are in deep shock. Not only the members of the opposition parties, they're not members of the democratic society, but also its own members of the president's party, Yoon Suk-yeol. Some of them were speaking against putting martial law into the power. At the moment, as we can see, they are trying to calm the situation, but knowing that the rates of support are so low, in my opinion, President Yoon Suk-yeol will go full confrontation with democratic society, with international society, because all the voices coming from all around the world at the moment regarding situation in South Korea, not North Korea, is a grave concern. This is what the Pentagon just moments ago said, that this is a grave concern over situation in South Korea, over path of democracy of this one of the most important allies of United States, because we have to understand that South Korea is 28,500 American troops in Korean Peninsula, and this is one of the most important allies of United States of America in Asia.
Thank you so much for your insight into the situation. Tomasz Sajewicz, Polish radio's correspondent to China and South Korea, coming to us from Singapore. President Joe Biden is in Angola for a rare visit to Africa. For the Biden administration, it is a chance to showcase how the U.S. has worked to develop a new partner in the global south and is trying to tap into Africa's prized mineral resources. Experts, however, warn, though, that this is a limited gain when compared to Russia's influence in Africa.
Joe Biden is given a helping hand by his host, President João Lourenço, in the Angolan capital. Welcomed with military honors, Biden is keen to demonstrate a U.S. success story in Africa.
My administration alone has invested over $3 billion in Angola thus far. The future of the world is here in Africa and in Angola.
He's promoting an American-backed rail scheme for transporting raw materials in the race to deliver critical minerals for the future.
Ladies and gentlemen,
the last time an American president visited sub-Saharan Africa was in 2015. Nearly a decade on, Russia has vastly increased its influence on the continent, first with the Wagner Group and now the Africa Corps.
We have a new Cold War going on right now. Russia is competing for the resources of Africa when it comes to the security sector, but of course also when it comes to the critical minerals, which are necessary to develop the new technologies, to pursue the energy transition, to be in the forefront of new economies.
Biden's visit comes less than a week after France was told by Chad and Senegal that their troops were no longer needed in their countries. Paris has already been kicked out of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, following a series of army takeovers. Moscow has promised more support to Syria after rebels advanced into the country's second-largest city, Aleppo. A long-term commitment could stretch Moscow's military machine. According to the Polish Institute for International Affairs, Russia's new Africa Corps was formed to displace Western political power. In the race for influence and raw materials in Africa, Moscow appears well set.
Wham's timeless holiday hit Last Christmas turns 40 on Tuesday. The popular song has cemented its place as a timeless festive anthem. On December 1st, 2024, the song became the most streamed holiday tune globally on Spotify, reaching over 8.5 million streams in a single day. Alex Sumlinsky has more.
Can you imagine the Christmas holidays without Last Christmas, I gave you my heart, but the very next day? That's right, Wham's hit single Last Christmas turns 40 today. So we hit the streets of Warsaw to find out what people think about this song.
Last Christmas, I gave you my heart, but the very next day, you gave it away.
Everyone knows the lyrics to Last Christmas, I Gave You My Heart.
But the very next day, you gave it away.
This year, to save me from tears, I'll give it to someone special.
There are many Christmas hits, but this particular one offers a different flavor of festive cheer, one that connects with listeners on a more introspective level.
And not only last year that I gave you my heart, forever I gave you my heart, and it's not Christmas every day.
In general, it's a give and take. You love your what do you call this? Your husband or your wife, and then you give all to her, whatever you can.
The song's legacy is also a testament to the genius of its author, even if someone asked on the street can't remember the exact lyrics.
I'm not just a follower of George Michael and his duo, right? But I remember it now.
Among the many Christmas songs, Last Christmas continues to hold a special place in the hearts of many and is a timeless piece associated with the holidays.
The song returns every year. It's a classic song. It's what makes Christmas, in my opinion, right?
Oh yes, of course.
It is so engraved in our minds that whenever you go to, I don't know, supermarket, it's inevitable to listen to this song.
So whether it's playing softly in the background during a family meeting or you're listening to it while you're driving on a snowy street, Last Christmas continues to bring joy and comfort. For TVP World from Warsaw, Alex Sumlinsky.
December 3rd marked the first day of the meeting between NATO's foreign ministers in Brussels. Ukraine's full NATO membership was one of the major points on the agenda. Ukraine is unwilling to accept, I quote, alternative surrogates or substitutes, as stated by Ukraine's foreign ministry. Is it the membership at all achievable? Would it stop Russia in its tracks or have an opposite effect? Peter Dixon, Ukraine Alert editor from the Atlantic Council, is joining me now to try and answer these questions. Good evening and welcome to the program.
Good evening.
So as we're looking at the meeting, exactly 30 years ago, Ukraine decided to give up its nuclear arms in return for guarantees of security from such powers as the US and Russia under the so-called Budapest Memorandum. And now Ukraine seems to be using this broken promise in order to be able to gain the full NATO membership. What is the prospect of this happening, given the dynamics on the front lines and the election of Donald Trump?
Well, NATO membership has always looked like a very, very big leap for Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion began in 2022, Ukraine had made almost no progress towards NATO membership, and it was widely understood that there was very little prospect of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. The NATO alliance had offered Ukraine some, what I would call, platitudes, comments that they would join eventually, or when they were ready, or when they met certain conditions. But essentially, there was no roadmap, and there was no commitment, and certainly no consensus on Ukraine joining. Now, has that changed since 2022? Arguably, the situation is now even more problematic. So, I think it certainly looks like a very big wish from Ukraine, a big push to try and get the NATO membership. It may, of course, be a way for Ukraine to leverage its position in negotiations by asking for full NATO membership and hoping to achieve something that is equivalent to that, that's something that is on that level. But I personally would say that full NATO membership at the moment looks as unlikely, or perhaps even more unlikely, than it did in 2022.
Do you think that NATO membership would actually stop Russia in its tracks? Would it change anything?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think NATO, if we look at Russia's actions in the last few decades, Putin has invaded Georgia, he's invaded Ukraine twice, he maintains soldiers in Moldova, but he's made no effort whatsoever, or he's shied away from anything that could be construed as aggression against the NATO alliance. In particular, there are 3 former Soviet republics that are part of NATO today, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the Baltics. None of them have come under threat, although, of course, Russia has historical claims to those lands, just as it has to Ukraine, or at least of a similar legitimacy in terms of its historic, those countries' historic background in the Russian Empire. So I think if we look at what Russia does and doesn't do, they're clearly very concerned about provoking a NATO response, and they've steered clear of that. Now, the question would be how to get Ukraine into the alliance. It's something that can't happen overnight. It's an accession process. And the real danger, I think, would be that while that process were underway, Russia would look to escalate and prevent it.
So today we are taking a closer look at the NATO meeting. We are sort of commemorating the Budapest Memorandum, and we heard some time ago from President Zelensky that Ukraine may rebuild its nuclear deterrent if it wasn't allowed into NATO. How likely is that scenario to take place, and what would it mean in a long term?
Well, this has been one of Ukraine's, again, bargaining positions, as it were. President Zelensky has actually said that he said very specifically in his meeting with President-elect Donald Trump before the US election. That was in September in New York. According to Zelensky's account, he said very specifically to Trump, either we get NATO membership or we look to resume our status as a nuclear power, which Ukraine unilaterally surrendered in 1994. So this is clearly a very provocative step. Technically, the opinion is divided on whether Ukraine could realistically achieve that or not in a short space of time. I would not be surprised if it were possible. Ukraine certainly has the technological basis to do so. It has the rocket technologies, it has the nuclear technologies. It could potentially be done. It would be very difficult to do it in secret, as it were. It would be known, the process would be clear and would be discovered. So I think there would be an enormous international backlash if Ukraine went down that road. It would certainly be a last resort option. I think at this stage, it is again part of Ukraine's attempts to strengthen its bargaining position and to say to the NATO alliance, to say to NATO members, look, we appreciate that you're concerned that you don't want to get into a confrontation with Russia, but we're fighting for our lives here. If we don't have the security of NATO membership, the only other thing that really could make us secure as a country would be to be a nuclear power.
A part of this discussion when it comes to Ukraine comes from what has been called here on TVP World by some of our experts the Trump effect. And we heard from the new Secretary General of NATO who warned Donald Trump, and he said not to push Ukraine to sign a peace deal that would see the leaders of Russia and Iran high-fiving each other. And he also specifically said that this agreement would actually create, I quote, dire security threat not only to Europe, but also to the US. Do you think that Donald Trump is going to listen to his words?
Well, I think this is actually probably one of the more persuasive arguments that one could use with Donald Trump. I think if the issue were merely Ukraine's security, Ukraine's sovereignty, or Russia's ambitions in the former Soviet space, Trump would be far more relaxed about the issue and be far more ready to make compromises that perhaps he wouldn't otherwise make. But when it's placed in a broader international context, and when you bring especially China into the equation, I think you're much more likely to get Trump's attention. We have seen over the last few years how the invasion of Ukraine has created an alliance amongst the authoritarian nations of the world, leading autocratic nations. So Russia, of course, the country engaged in this invasion, but also alongside them, they forged very close ties with China. They have the backing of the Iranians. We have the North Koreans now also providing troops, ballistic missiles, artillery shells. So we have an axis of authoritarian countries forming up here, which poses a threat across the board. This is already impacting on Israel's security. There is little doubt, I think, realistically, long term, that if this axis of authoritarians continues to gain strength, then they're going to go after American interests. So in the medium to long term, there's a lot more at stake here for America than merely their status as a superpower and their credibility as a partner of Ukraine. Their own interests will become will suffer if Putin is able to secure a very advantageous peace deal in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Peter Dickinson from Ukraine Alert Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining me tonight. And so this would be all the latest news for now, but please do stay tuned here on TVP World as we will be back in just a moment with more news and features.